In 1814, deep in the rolling countryside of Virginia, there was a widow whose name history barely remembers. Yet, the whispers about her orchard have survived far longer than the orchard itself. The year was unsettled. The War of 1812 had just ended, leaving the state scarred with loss, poverty, and broken families. In that quiet aftermath, when many households mourned sons and fathers, this widow cultivated not only apples, but something darker secrets that would be carried in hushed tones for generations. It begins, as so many grim tales do, with an ordinary scene: a patch of land, a small house, and an orchard that stretched like a ribcage of gnarled branches behind the homestead. To most travelers, it was unremarkable. Yet, locals in the surrounding villages told stories of strange sounds at night, of earth turned over too often near the roots of her trees, of men who entered her life only to vanish into silence. If you love dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing for more stories like this one, because this tale is not written in textbooks, but in the shadows of memory. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you live sometimes? Knowing the hour makes the story hit a little harder. The widow herself, according to fragmented reports, was neither young nor beautiful in the conventional sense, but she carried herself with the certainty of someone who had learned to survive. Some described her as tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to notice everything. Others swore she possessed an unholy grace, a way of making men feel chosen when she turned her attention upon them. Her orchard, planted years earlier by her late father, became her livelihood. In the early 19th century, orchards were not merely for fruit, they were for cider, the daily drink of Virginians. Cider was safer than water, a household staple, and those who owned orchards held a subtle power over their neighbors. Perhaps it was coincidence that her orchard thrived while others faltered, producing fruit almost unnaturally abundant. Or perhaps the soil beneath her trees was fed with more than rainwater and manure. Villagers whispered of her first marriage, though the details were always hazy. Some said she had wed young, her husband a farmer who died in an accident. Others said sickness claimed him, and that she personally oversaw his burial beneath the orchard, an unusual choice, since most families in Virginia had plots consecrated near churches. Why had she chosen to place him beneath the roots of her trees? Was it grief, superstition, or calculation? The answer was never clear. After the war, when soldiers limped home with missing limbs and broken spirits, the widow's home became strangely sought after. Men who had nothing, no land, no hope, saw in her both stability and mystery. She was older, yes, but she owned property, something many men desperately desired in a time when land meant survival. And she welcomed them, at first with warmth, later with ceremony, and finally with silence. One by one, suitors came. One by one, they vanished. Some died of fever, others of what neighbors called the wasting sickness. But oddly, their funerals were small, quick, and without clergy. The orchard became their graveyard, though none spoke it openly. Each mound of earth was explained away: an accident, an illness, a tragedy of fate. Yet the soil seemed freshly turned too often, the ground restless with secrets. The widow walked each evening among her trees with a lantern. Villagers claimed. They swore they saw her pausing by the mounds, her lips moving in whispers, as if speaking to those below. Some said she prayed, others that she bargained. But all agreed there was something uncanny about the orchard, its silence too deep, its branches arching like skeletal fingers, its fruit heavy even in years of drought. Children dared each other to steal apples from her land, but most would not. A few who tried claimed the fruit tasted strange, metallic, as though it carried the bitterness of earth rather than sweetness of sun. One boy even swore that when he bit into a stolen apple, He saw a sliver of white in the flesh that looked like bone. His mother beat him for lying, but he never set foot near the orchard again. No one knows exactly when the rumors began in earnest. Some say after the second husband, some after the third. But by 1814, the orchard had become a place of unease, a place where people crossed themselves when they passed by on horseback. And yet, the widow remained untouchable. She was a landowner, independent in a society that had little tolerance for such women, and that very independence both inspired fear and fostered silence. Who would accuse her, who would dig into the earth to prove the whispers in those days? Law and superstition often blurred. Witchcraft trials were no longer common, but the memory of them lingered. A woman who defied expectations, who lived alone, who seemed untouched by grief even after bearing multiple husbands, such a woman was regarded with suspicion. But suspicion was not evidence, and so the widow's orchard grew, season after season, while the whispers around her only deepened. The tale of the widow of Virginia is not one of swift violence or bloody spectacle. It is one of patience, of a soil that swallowed men quietly, of a woman who seemed always to stand just outside the grasp of judgment. And as 1814 stretched on, her story had only begun to weave itself into the fabric of dread that still clings to that place, where once an orchard stood and where, some say, the ground still remembers. The widow's isolation was not entirely of her own making. The war had carved deep wounds into the community, and like so many others, she had been left behind. The men who once filled the taverns and churches were gone, buried on distant fields or scattered in shallow graves along muddy roads. What remained were the broken ones, crippled veterans, drifters, and men who carried scars both visible and hidden. For these men, the widow's homestead appeared like a promised food, shelter, and perhaps even the chance to start anew. Yet she was not the sort of woman who inspired pity. Those who visited her described a presence that demanded attention. She did not lower her eyes when men spoke. She did not wait for their approval. Instead, she offered cider poured from her own orchard, cool and sharp, a taste that lingered long after the cup was empty. Some whispered that she laced her drink with herbs, or worse, with poison so subtle that only she knew the difference between a tonic and a death sentence. Neighbors recalled that she often walked into the small town nearby to sell her cider and fruit. She stood taller than most women, her dark dresses stark against the pale bonnets of others. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts when she passed, though the adults scolded them for rudeness. To her face, no one accused her of anything. But behind her back, suspicions grew. Why was her orchard so full when others bore only sparse fruit? Why did the men she chose seem to vanish so quickly, despite the unease? She drew suitors. Loneliness, after all, was a heavy burden in those days. Men who had lost wives to childbirth or disease saw in her a second chance. They ignored the rumors, convincing themselves that stories were only that, stories. And for a time, she seemed almost ordinary. She attended Sunday service sitting near the back, her head covered in a plain bonnet. She even sang the hymns, though some said her voice carried an edge, like a note slightly off-key. Her second marriage, the one that followed soon after the war, was spoken of in contradictory tones. Some said the man was a soldier who had returned half-crippled, grateful for her hospitality. Others insisted he was a drifter with no past worth mentioning. What everyone agreed on was this: he did not last long. Within months, his health declined. First, a cough that would not leave. Then a pallor, a wasting away that left him thin and pale as candle wax. Neighbors offered help, but the widow refused, insisting she could tend to her husband herself. Those who stopped by swore they saw him lying in bed, too weak to lift his head, while she spooned broth into his mouth. And then one night, the lanterns in the orchard glowed long past midnight. By morning, the man was gone, and a fresh mound of earth rose between two apple trees. The explanation was swift fever had taken him, and the widow had honored his request to be buried beneath the land he had worked. But no one had seen a preacher preside. No one had heard a funeral prayer. Only the widow, standing with dirt under her fingernails, offered the tale. It was in this period that people began to view her less as a woman and more as a figure of fascination. How did she endure such loss without breaking? Other women wept openly at graves, wearing mourning black for years. Yet she seemed untouched, her eyes dry, her posture unbent. Some said it was strength. Others said it was something darker, a coldness that no human should possess. Still, men came. The orchard drew them like moths to flame. Perhaps they convinced themselves that she had simply suffered misfortune. After all, death was everywhere in those days: cholera, influenza, accidents in the fields. Was it truly so strange that one woman should know more loss than most, yet in their hearts? Doubt flickered. The orchard soil was too rich, too disturbed, and her gaze too steady when she spoke of the men who had gone before. Her reputation grew in strange ways. Women whispered about her in kitchens, cautioning their husbands not to linger near her land, but some of those same husbands visited her still, drawn by curiosity or desire. Men spoke of her in taverns with a mix of awe and unease. She's cursed, some said. She's blessed, argued others, pointing to her prosperity in a time of scarcity. And always, the orchard stood in the background, a silent witness to her story. One particular tale spread among children that at night, if you crept close enough, you could hear voices under the soil, not groans or cries, but murmurs, as if the earth itself whispered secrets back to her. No one could say who started the story, but it lingered, taking on a life of its own. Parents dismissed it as nonsense, yet many forbade their children from going near her property after dark. By the second burial, the community's unease had turned to quiet dread. People avoided her eyes in church. They no longer invited her to gatherings. But still, no one confronted her. Independence was rare for a woman, and land ownership rarer still. To accuse her without proof would risk shame or worse, retaliation. So they watched and whispered and waited as the widow walked her orchard with her lantern, her shadow long and thin among the trees. It was only a matter of time before the cycle repeated. Another suitor would come, another mound of earth would rise. And each time, the question grew louder. Though none dared speak it aloud, were these tragedies mere coincidence? Or was the orchard becoming a graveyard built one husband at a time? The third man who came into the widow's life was different from the first two. He was not a drifter, nor a crippled veteran clinging to the remnants of survival. He was a tradesman, some say a blacksmith. Others, a traveling peddler of tools and ironware. His hands were strong, his shoulders broad, and his laughter quick to rise. For a time, his presence seemed to breathe new life into the widow's home. The orchard, already fertile, appeared almost aglow with vigor during that year, its branches sagging under the weight of fruit. Neighbors noticed the change. For once, she seemed almost softened, her expression warmer, her steps lighter as she worked alongside her new husband. He built new fences, repaired the roof, and was seen at market boasting of his wife's cider. Perhaps, the villagers thought, her misfortunes had finally come to an end. Perhaps this marriage would last. But then came the sickness. It began slowly: fatigue, a heaviness in his chest, nights where he could not sleep. He grew pale, though his body had once been so robust. Soon he was unable to work, lying in bed while the widow tended to him with herbs and broths. She told those who inquired that it was consumption, the dreaded illness that had taken so many before. But some whispered that they had seen him drinking cider from her own hand, his lips pressed to the cup while she watched with an expression that was neither grief nor love, but something harder to define. Within weeks, he was gone. The burial was swifter than before. A minister was said to have been called, though none remembered his name. Some villagers swore they saw no priest at all, only the widow, digging late at night, lantern swaying as she worked the soil herself. By morning, the mound was there, fresh and damp, nestled between two older graves. This third death was harder to dismiss as mere misfortune. 3 husbands, each gone in quick succession, each buried beneath the orchard rather than in consecrated ground. The people of the nearby town began to murmur openly now, their whispers no longer confined to kitchens and taverns. Some said she was cursed. Others claimed she had struck a bargain with the devil, exchanging the lives of her husbands for prosperity. After all, her orchard seemed more abundant each year, its cider richer and more potent than any other sold at market. A visiting minister from another county took a particular notice. He had heard the tales from parishioners and decided to investigate, driven by both duty and curiosity. He arrived at her home unannounced one evening, finding the widow in her orchard. She greeted him with a politeness that seemed rehearsed, her face expressionless in the flickering glow of her lantern. He asked about her husbands, about the strange choice of burial ground. She answered calmly, saying only that each man had wished to rest in the soil he had worked, close to the trees that had sustained them. The minister was unsettled. He later recounted that, while they spoke, he felt as though the orchard was listening, the branches arching above like bent backs, the shadows curling around him. When he left, he urged local men to dig into the graves, to see whether the bodies had truly been laid to rest, but fear and hesitation silenced them. No one wanted to be the one to disturb the soil, to risk uncovering something that could not be forgotten, and so the graves remained closed. Still, the rumors deepened. Travelers passing through were warned to avoid the widow's cider, to decline her hospitality no matter how warmly it was offered. Some believed she was a poisoner, using herbs to sicken her husbands, their bodies feeding the roots of her trees. Others whispered that she was no ordinary woman at all, but a witch, her orchard a place of ritual where men were sacrificed to keep the land fertile. Children, as children do, made games of the rumors. They dared one another to run into the orchard at night, to touch one of the graves and return. Most fled before they reached the trees, spooked by the creak of branches or the cry of an owl. But one boy, braver or more foolish than the rest, claimed he placed his hand on the soil of the newest grave and felt warmth rising from it as though the earth itself still held the fever of the dying man. He swore he heard faint scratching beneath the surface, like nails clawing at wood. His story spread quickly, adding fuel to the unease. The widow, meanwhile, remained unchanged. She attended church less frequently now, citing her work as an excuse. When she did appear, she sat alone, her gaze fixed not on the minister but on the floor, her lips unmoving during the hymns. Some said the pew around her always felt colder than the rest of the church, though none dared sit close enough to prove it. Her orchard became both her sanctuary and her prison. No one visited her openly anymore, though men still eyed her from afar. It was said she had money enough, land enough, and fruit enough to provide a comfortable life for anyone who would risk her side. And so, despite the shadows gathering around her reputation, suitors would still come. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not boldly, but eventually, for in that time and place, the prospect of land and security was stronger than fear. And so the stage was set 3 graves beneath the orchard, 3 men gone, and a community caught between dread and silence. They whispered, they speculated, but still they did nothing. The soil held its secrets, and the widow walked among her trees, lantern swaying, as though she were tending not to fruit, but to the restless dead that slept beneath her roots. By the time the fourth husband entered her life, the whispers had taken on a rhythm of their own. The villagers no longer spoke in hushed tones only by firelight. They muttered in daylight, heads turning as the widow passed by. Baskets of apples balanced on her hip. 3 men buried under the same orchard was already too much to dismiss as coincidence. But when she took a 4th man into her home, the entire county seemed to watch, waiting for the pattern to continue. The 4th husband was said to be a merchant of modest wealth, a man who owned 2 mules and a wagon that carried cloth, spices, and rare goods along Virginia's trade roads. He was older than the previous men, a widower himself, who claimed he had no fear of gossip. "A woman can't be blamed for bad luck," he told a tavern crowd. "If anything, she's stronger than the rest, still standing after so much sorrow." His words were bold, but they trembled beneath their confidence, as though he knew even then that he was walking into a story darker than most men could bear. The widow welcomed him, as she had the others. 2 outsiders, their marriage seemed quiet, even ordinary. He brought wealth to the homestead, expanding her trade in cider, while she managed the orchard with her usual intensity. For a brief season, things looked different. The merchant rode to market with her, their wagon heavy with fruit and barrels of drink. He laughed at customers, charmed buyers, and seemed determined to prove the townsfolk wrong that this woman was no curse, but a blessing. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, unease grew once again. Travelers noticed how often the merchant was absent from market, replaced by the widow's silent figure. Neighbors saw him less, and when they did, his face was gaunt, his laughter replaced with labored breath. He confided to one man that he suffered from strange dreams, nights where he felt buried alive, the press of soil heavy on his chest. He would wake gasping, sweat soaking his clothes, while his wife sat watching in the dim glow of the lantern. The sickness followed soon after. His body weakened rapidly, far too fast for any natural illness. His hands trembled, his skin turned gray, and he could barely hold down food. The widow insisted she was caring for him, boiling herbs and teas, but some wondered if her remedies were the very things draining him of life. The villagers no longer pretended not to see the pattern. They gathered in clusters, speaking of poison, of curses, of earth that grew fat on human remains. Still, no one confronted her. Fear bound their tongues, as though speaking the truth aloud would draw her gaze upon them. When at last he died, his burial followed the same ritual as before. No public service, no priest, only another mound of disturbed soil beneath the apple trees, pressed flat by her own hands. It was said she stood by that fresh grave all night, whispering words too soft to hear. From the distance, neighbors saw her lantern swinging among the branches, its glow painting long shadows across the ground. Some claimed they saw another figure standing with her tall, indistinct, shaped like a man, yet dissolving into mist when approached. By now, the orchard had changed. Its branches seemed to twist unnaturally, the bark rough and blackened in places. The apples were larger, heavier, almost swollen with juice. Cider from her barrels was unlike any other in the county, thicker, sweeter, but leaving a strange aftertaste that clung to the throat. Some refused to drink it altogether, but others could not resist, insisting it was the finest they had ever tasted. Those who drank too much often complained of vivid dreams, dreams of suffocation, of lying in the dark, of voices murmuring through the soil. The pattern of the soil itself became impossible to ignore. Each grave was a neat mound, but the ground between them began to sink, as though the orchard was swallowing the dead deeper into its roots. Some swore that on stormy nights, lightning revealed shapes in the earth of the outlines of faces, hands pressing upward, mouths frozen in silence. Children dared one another to look, and those who claimed they had ran home pale, too terrified to speak of what they had seen. At this stage, the community could not hide its fear. Some wanted to dig, to uncover the graves and prove what lay beneath. But others argued that disturbing the soil would bring a curse upon them all. There were whispers of calling in magistrates, of forcing an inquiry, but those voices were quickly silenced. For in rural Virginia of 1814, authority often lay not in law, but in land. And the widow's land was hers alone, untouchable without direct cause. So the villagers kept their distance, crossing themselves when they passed her property, urging their children never to stray near the trees. They spoke of her as if she were both woman and myth, a creature caught between this world and another. Some pitied her, claiming she must be lonely beyond bearing. Others said she felt no loneliness at all, only hunger for men, hunger for souls, hunger for something no orchard should feed upon. And still she walked each night with her lantern, her shadow long among the trees. The graves grew in number, the whispers grew in strength, and the pattern in the soil became undeniable. The widow's orchard was no longer simply a place of fruit. It was a ledger, each mound a record of the men who had entered her life and left only as roots, bones, and shadows beneath the earth. By the time the fourth grave settled into the orchard, the whispers had become nearly as heavy as the soil itself. Men passing through the county heard the tale before they even saw her land the widow with the apple trees, the woman whose husbands vanished into the ground. It was said in taverns as far as Richmond, carried like smoke down river roads. Some dismissed it as gossip spun by jealous neighbors, while others repeated it with the conviction of those telling a warning, "Do not linger near her orchard after dark, for the soil is restless and the trees drink deeply." Yet into this darkness stepped the fifth man. His name, if it was ever recorded, is lost to time. Some described him as a farmhand seeking stability. Others claimed he was a carpenter, drawn to her homestead to repair her barn and never leaving. What all agreed on was his vigor. He was young, strong, and confident, the kind of man who believed misfortune could be beaten with labor and laughter. Perhaps he thought he would be the one to break the widow's curse, or perhaps he never believed there was a curse at all. Neighbors noticed he walked differently than the men before him. He carried himself as though the orchard was his, waving to passers-by, boasting of the fruit that would be harvested that season. He worked hard, building a new pen for livestock, pruning the trees, and even planting a few saplings at the edge of the property. For a brief while, it seemed as though life had returned to the homestead. Children playing nearby even claimed they heard laughter from the house, a sound long absent from that grim place. But the pattern was merciless. The man fell ill in the early autumn, just as the apples ripened and the air turned sharp with the scent of cider. His sickness was strange sudden chills, dizziness, and a dark rash that spread across his chest. He grew weak rapidly, his strength dissolving like sugar in water. The widow tended to him, as she always had, feeding him from her hand, mixing drinks laced with bitter herbs. He wasted away, confined to his bed, his eyes glassy as if staring at something only he could see. By then, the villagers had learned to watch the orchard for signs. Lanterns burning at midnight, freshly dug earth, the faint echo of shovels striking soil. And once again, they were not disappointed, or rather, they were confirmed in their dread. One morning, a new mound of dirt rose beneath the trees, the fifth grave marked only by the unnatural lushness of the branches above it. It was this burial that stirred the visiting minister's suspicions into something stronger. He returned, urging the townsfolk to act. No Christian man should rest without prayer, he warned. If these graves are what she claims, then let us prove it. If not, then the truth will save us from fear." But the villagers hesitated. To dig was to defy not only the widow, but something greater, the force they all felt pressing against them when they neared the orchard. It was as though the air itself thickened, warning them back. The minister, frustrated, went himself. He claimed later that as he approached the orchard with his spade, the widow appeared between the trees, lantern in hand, her face half lit and cold. She asked him calmly what he sought. He replied that he wanted to ensure the men were buried with dignity. Her answer chilled him. The soil knows them. That is dignity enough. He fled that night, refusing to return. Still, the rumors grew. Livestock began to die near the widow's property, cows born still, horses collapsing without explanation. Some villagers swore they saw strange lights flickering among the branches at night. Pale glows like will-o'-the-wisps that hovered above the graves. Others spoke of sounds a low humming, a kind of chant carried on the wind. It was said that if you stood at the orchard's edge at midnight, you could hear the trees creak not like wood, but like voices rising together, as though a congregation buried beneath the soil still sought to speak. Fear deepened into superstition. Women whispered of witchcraft, remembering the tales their mothers had told of charms, curses, and bargains with the devil. Men spoke of poison, pointing to the widow's herbs and her uncanny knowledge of tinctures, but none dared act. Land was power, and her land seemed untouchable. The widow, for her part, carried on as though nothing had changed. She sold her cider in town, her face unreadable, her hands steady. When asked about her husband's passing, she offered the same refrain: illness had taken him, and she had laid him to rest in the soil he loved. Always the same words, always the same soil. The fifth grave marked a turning point. It was no longer a matter of misfortune, no longer an accident of fate. 5 men, 5 mounds beneath the orchard, and still the widow walked unbroken, her lantern swaying each night as she passed among the trees. The villagers began to avoid even speaking her name aloud, as though words alone could summon her gaze. But the soil was restless. Floods loomed that autumn, and with them came the danger that the orchard's secrets, long hidden, long whispered, might finally surface, for patterns can be buried but never erased, and the widow's orchard had grown too heavy with silence to hold its truth forever. If the 5th grave had unsettled the villagers, the widow's 6th marriage plunged them into something darker, a conviction that the orchard itself was cursed, that each man who stepped across her threshold was already a marked man. By now, even those who had once defended her fell silent. 5 husbands buried under the same trees was beyond coincidence. It was ritual, deliberate, and unholy. Yet, as it happened each time before, another man was drawn to her door. This 6th husband was unlike the others. He was younger, wealthier, and came from a family outside the county. Some said he was a merchant's son who had inherited money. Others believed he was a lawyer, educated and self-assured. What mattered was this: he was confident enough to dismiss the villagers' warnings. To him, the widow's reputation was nothing more than superstition spun by poor farmers. He boasted in taverns that he would tame her orchard and prove the rumors false. Fear makes fools of men, he declared. And I am no fool. The widow received him with a composure that chilled those who watched. She neither welcomed nor resisted his courtship. She simply allowed it, as though she knew already what fate would follow. They married quickly, their union sealed not in church but at her homestead, with only a handful of witnesses. When asked why, she said simply, "The orchard is witness enough." The phrase lingered, repeated in whispers across the town. At first, the 6th husband seemed to thrive. He spent money freely, repairing fences, hiring hands to work the land, even ordering barrels for cider trade that would stretch into other counties. He spoke of expanding, of turning her modest orchard into a prosperous estate. Some villagers dared to believe perhaps he was different, that wealth and willpower might shield him from whatever fate had claimed the others, but the widow's gaze remained the same, cold, steady, watchful, and the orchard, no matter how much it grew, seemed to resist his ambition. Workers complained of unease, saying they felt watched as they pruned branches. Some quit without explanation, refusing even their wages. Others told stories of tools vanishing overnight, only to reappear buried in soft earth near the graves. The sixth husband dismissed these fears. He mocked the villagers, drank heavily of the cider, and boasted that his wife was misunderstood. Yet, privately, his confidence faltered. A servant reported that he often woke in the night gasping, clutching his chest as though pressed by an invisible weight. He began to sleep less, wandering the orchard at midnight, muttering to himself. And then came the signs. Livestock once again sickened. Chickens laid eggs streaked with blood. On stormy nights, neighbors swore they saw multiple lanterns glowing in the orchard, though the widow carried only one. Strange figures, shadows too tall, too thin, were said to move among the trees, keeping pace with her as she walked. The man's health declined soon after. This time, however, he resisted. Unlike the others, he sought remedies from outside the widow's control, calling upon physicians in town. They found no illness they could name, only a wasting of strength, as if something were draining him from within. He confessed to one doctor that each night he felt himself sinking, not into sleep, but into soil, as though the orchard had already claimed him. The doctor dismissed it as delirium, but his words spread quickly, feeding the villagers' terror. When his decline became undeniable, the widow shut her doors. No one was allowed inside. Smoke rose from her chimney, carrying the scent of bitter herbs, of something acrid that burned the throat. Days passed without a glimpse of him, until, finally, the lanterns flared in the orchard once more. By dawn, another mound of earth had joined the others. The villagers did not need to ask. They knew. The sixth grave was there, fresh and heavy. 6 men now fed the soil, 6 husbands lost, 6 patterns repeated without mercy. And still no trial came. No magistrate was summoned. The fear was too great, the superstition too thick. To accuse her was to risk sharing their fate. From that moment, the orchard was no longer merely feared. It was avoided entirely. Travelers turned their carts around rather than pass near it. Children refused to look in its direction. The cider barrels she sold were purchased only by strangers who did not know the story, for the locals would not touch a drop. And yet, the widow walked each night, lantern in hand, her figure gliding among the graves. Some swore she was no longer alone, that the shadows followed her, 6 shapes moving in silence, bound to her orchard like servants to their mistress. Others claimed they saw her standing still for hours, her hand pressed against the soil as if listening. What did she hear? The whispers of the dead or the hunger of the earth? Demanding more, the 6th grave cemented the legend. She was no longer just a woman. She was an omen, a figure of fear whose orchard was said to grow sweeter with each man it consumed. And though some hoped she might finally stop 6 being enough, 6 being a number both holy and cursed, others feared the pattern would continue until the soil could bear no more. For patterns, once begun, rarely end on their own. By the autumn, after the 6th grave, fear of the widow had deepened into something close to reverence. The townsfolk no longer whispered merely of poison or misfortune. They spoke of forces older and darker, of bargains struck not with men but with shadows. For how else could a single woman outlast 6 husbands, all buried in the same orchard? Without once facing the hand of the law, it was then that the word witchcraft began to rise on the lips of the villagers. Virginia had long since abandoned the spectacle of witch trials, but memory lingers. In an isolated community, where fields still depended on rain and children still died in cradles, superstition was as real as scripture. And when the orchard glowed at night with pale lights, when livestock refused to graze near its edge, the word seemed inevitable. Strange things were said to have happened that winter. Livestock miscarried, leaving stillborn calves in the snow. Crows gathered in unusual numbers on the branches of her trees, so many that their cries could be heard across the valley. At night, travelers swore they saw fire flickering in the orchard, though no smoke followed, and more than one villager claimed that if you stood quietly at the fence line, you could hear chanting low, steady, and distinctly human drifting between the trunks. The widow, for her part, neither confirmed nor denied the stories. She moved through town rarely now, her visits swift, her eyes unreadable. When she passed, women crossed themselves and men tipped their hats in silence. No one dared confront her. It was said that to meet her gaze too long was to invite a dream of burial, to wake with the taste of soil in your mouth. Among the children, the orchard became a place of dares. They would creep near its edge, daring each other to touch the fence or steal an apple. But the fruit was strange. Those who bit into it swore it tasted of iron, of rot, as if something inside the soil had seeped upward into the flesh. One boy fell ill after such a dare, feverish and delirious for days, whispering in his sleep of faces beneath the earth, eyes open and staring upward. Superstition thickened like fog. Women claimed the widow carried charms beneath her dress, amulets of bone or hair. Men muttered that she could call storms when she wished, pointing to sudden tempests that tore through the valley, sparing only her orchard. Some even swore they saw her shadow moving independently of her body, lingering a heartbeat too long when she walked past the glow of a lantern. Fear bred silence, but silence bred fascination. Stories grew wild. Some claimed she lured men not by beauty, but by enchantment, casting spells in her cider so that those who drank were bound to her. Others believed she whispered to the roots of her trees, feeding them names of men who would come, and the orchard itself drew them in. Whatever the truth, the result was the same 6 graves, 6 vanished husbands, and a woman who walked untouched among the living. The villagers debated what to do. A few men spoke of burning the orchard, of ending the curse with fire, but no one dared act. Fire could spread, law could punish, and superstition warned that harming her trees might unleash something far worse than whispers. In the end, they did nothing, as they always had. Fear kept them still, and the widow's orchard continued to grow. There were sightings, 2 reports of things not easily explained. A farmhand swore he saw a man's face pressed against the soil of one grave, mouth open as if screaming. A traveler passing by claimed he glimpsed a figure hanging from the branches, pale and swaying, but when he returned with others, the tree was empty. On moonless nights, people said, the orchard glowed faintly, as if lit from below by fires no one had kindled. Through it all, the widow walked with her lantern, her shadow stretching long among the rows. Some swore she was speaking as she moved, her lips forming words not of prayer, but of command. What language she used, no one knew, but the trees seemed to respond, their branches creaking like voices answering her. By then, she was not merely feared, she was believed to hold power, the kind that could curse or bless with equal weight. A few brave souls even sought her out in secret, begging for charms against illness, for blessings on their crops. They left coins or gifts at the orchard's edge, and sometimes, when they returned days later, their fortunes seemed improved. Whether by coincidence or by bargain, they could not say. The orchard itself bore the greatest change. Its apples grew larger, almost grotesque in size, their skins dark and glossy. The cider brewed from them was said to be intoxicating, thicker than wine, leaving those who drank it restless and plagued by dreams. In those dreams, men spoke of walking rows of trees where hands reached up from the soil, clutching at their ankles, pulling them downward. Few who tasted it more than once dared return for another cup. The word witchcraft became fact in the minds of many, though none dared bring it to authority, and so the legend solidified a widow whose husbands lay buried not in consecrated ground, but beneath apple trees that thrived unnaturally, a woman who seemed untouchable by law, shielded by fear and superstition alike, and an orchard where every breeze carried whispers, every shadow hinted at something watching. The pattern was complete, the superstition cemented. Yet still, the villagers waited, for if 6 men had already been claimed, who could believe that the orchard's hunger had been satisfied? The 6th grave had barely settled into the soil before another story began to unfold. Despite all warnings, despite the whispers of curses and witchcraft, a 7th man appeared at the widow's orchard. He was younger than most, wealthier than any, and carried himself with the self-assurance of one who had always believed fate bent to his will. Some said he was a landowner's son from across the river. Others claimed he was a merchant, newly arrived from Richmond. What mattered was that he possessed both youth and fortune, and he believed that made him untouchable. Unlike the others, he did not arrive quietly. He courted the widow openly, riding into town with her at his side, boasting that superstition would not govern him. Men die, he told anyone who dared to caution him. Sickness takes them. Accidents claim them. And fear rots a man faster than any poison. I will not waste away in fear. His confidence stirred unease. The villagers had seen too many before him, men who had entered her home strong and left only as mounds beneath the orchard. Yet, who among them could stop him? The wedding was spoken of for months. He insisted on a public ceremony, daring fate itself. Unlike her past unions, this one was held at the church, with hymns sung and vows spoken before God. Some believed this might protect him. The consecration would shield him from the curse. But others whispered that the widow's eyes never turned toward the altar, only toward the orchard visible in the distance through the open doors. For a time, the marriage seemed different. The young husband invested his wealth into the homestead, hiring workers, ordering carts of supplies, and speaking of expanding the cider trade to new counties. He was determined to prove the orchard could be more than a graveyard of men, that it could be an empire. For weeks, he seemed untouchable, riding into town in fine clothes, laughing loudly, dismissing the whispers that followed him. But the orchard does not forget. It began with small things. Workers he hired quit suddenly, complaining of strange noises among the trees, of whispers that seemed to follow them as they pruned branches. A hired hand claimed he saw eyes in the soil, open and staring, when he bent down to tie his boot. Another swore that when he leaned against one tree he felt it pulse, as though a heartbeat throbbed within the trunk. The young husband dismissed them all as fools and liars, but his workers fled, leaving the orchard to him and his wife once more. Then came the dreams. He spoke of them openly at first, laughing them off visions of standing among the graves, hearing muffled cries beneath his feet. But soon the laughter faded. He began waking in terror, gasping as though smothered by earth. Servants claimed they found him wandering outside at night, barefoot, as if pulled toward the orchard by invisible hands. The widow, they said, followed him silently with her lantern, never stopping him, only watching. His health declined quickly after. It was not fever this time, nor consumption, nor rash. Instead, it was a wasting of will. His once confident stride slowed. His face grew gaunt, his eyes shadowed, as though he were already half buried. He stopped eating, stopped speaking to townsfolk, and remained within the orchard's borders. When he did appear in town, he seemed thinner, his clothes hanging loose, his gaze distant. Neighbors began to count the days, waiting for the inevitable. They knew by then how the pattern unfolded. The orchard demanded, and it was never denied. The only question was when. That summer, storms lashed the valley. Rain swelled the rivers, and thunder cracked over the hills. On one such night, lanterns were seen moving through the orchard again, 2, then 3, though no one could say who held them. Figures shifted between the trees, too tall, too many to be only the widow and her husband. Lightning illuminated the rows, and some swore they saw shapes rising from the soil, hands reaching, faces pressing upward. By dawn, the 7th mound was there. Another grave, fresh and raw, resting among the others. The young husband was gone. No word of illness, no official cause of death, only silence, and the widow's steady presence as she tended the soil. The villagers were not surprised. By now, surprise had long since given way to grim certainty, yet with each grave their fear deepened. What force could compel man after man to her side? No matter how loudly the warnings rang, what hunger lay in that orchard, disguised as fruit and cider, and most haunting of all, how many more would join them before the soil was satisfied. The widow did not weep, did not. She did not explain. She simply continued as she always had, her lantern swaying at night, her lips moving in whispers no one could hear. Some claimed she now walked with companions 6, then 7 shadows moving just behind her, men who had once lived and laughed and now followed her in silence. And so the pattern stretched on. The orchard had consumed again. The curse, if it was a curse, showed no sign of breaking. The soil was fed, the trees thrived, and the villagers remained paralyzed, terrified of her, terrified of the orchard, and terrified of the question none dared speak aloud: when would the next man come by the spring following the 7th grave? The valley seemed weighted with silence. The villagers no longer asked if another husband would vanish into the orchard, but when. Fear had hardened into expectation, and yet something shifted that year. For the first time, it was not gossip that drew attention to the widow's land, but nature itself. Heavy rains fell across Virginia, flooding creeks and rivers until fields drowned under brown water. The widow's orchard, perched on slightly higher ground, survived better than most. But the storms unsettled the soil. Water carved rivulets down the slopes, dragging mud and roots with it. And when the villagers passed by after the worst of the floods, they swore the earth had given up what it had swallowed. One farmer, driving his cart along the road near her property, claimed he saw bones jutting through the loosened soil long, pale, unmistakable. Another said he glimpsed cloth, rotted but recognizable as the lining of a coat. Children who crept close whispered that the mounds no longer looked like graves, but like wounds split open, each one exposing fragments of what lay beneath. The orchard's secret, once buried, was being forced to the surface. Whispers turned to open talk. Men gathered in the tavern, voices hushed but firm. "It cannot go on," they said. The land itself cries out. Some urged immediate action, digging, inquiry, perhaps even fire. Others balked, insisting the risk was too great. "Would you dig where 7 men lie?" one demanded. "Would you open graves the devil himself has claimed?" In the end, fear won again, and nothing was done. Yet the story spread beyond the county. Travelers carried tales of bones beneath apple trees, of a widow who buried her husbands in soil that refused to keep its silence. A magistrate from a nearby town was said to have taken interest, though whether he truly came to investigate or only listened from afar remains uncertain. In these half-remembered accounts, His name is never kept, only the impression a man who asked questions, then asked no more. The widow herself did not flinch. She tended her orchard as though nothing had changed, her figure steady among the branches even as the soil sagged and revealed its secrets. Neighbors swore they saw her pressing the earth back with her own hands, as though reburying what the rains had unearthed. At night, her lantern glowed brighter than ever, swinging between trees with a rhythm almost ritualistic. But unease now grew into dread. Some claimed to hear voices in the orchard after the floods, not murmurs as before, but cries, strained and desperate, carried on the damp air. One woman swore she heard her dead brother's voice calling her name from beneath the soil. Another man claimed he heard laughter, high and sharp, echoing from the trees though no one stood there. Whether truth or terror-fed imagination, the orchard became unbearable to approach. The cider, too, changed. Barrels sent to market that year were described as darker, thicker, almost syrup-like. Those who drank it spoke of visions' faces in the bottoms of their cups, the taste of iron and rot clinging to their tongues, dreams of suffocation. Word spread, and many refused to buy it at all. Yet some still sought it, believing it held power that to drink it was to taste the strength of the men buried beneath the orchard. Accusations began to form, timid but insistent. She is a murderer, some said. She feeds them to the trees. Others called her a witch outright, claiming she bargained with shadows that lived in the roots. But when pressed for action, the accusers fell silent. Fear was stronger than justice, and superstition stronger still. And so, again, nothing was done. That summer, more storms came. The orchard grew thick with fruit, heavier than ever before, as though the trees had feasted on the chaos of the floods. Apples bent branches to the ground, swollen and dark, their skins bruised with strange markings that some swore looked like faces. Villagers avoided them, but children told stories of daring each other to bite into one. A few did, and spat out seeds that tasted bitter as ash. The widow, untouched, carried on. She sold her harvest quietly, watched by eyes that dared not meet hers. Some claimed she no longer walked alone at night. They saw figures behind her men-shaped shadows keeping pace, their movements slow and uneven, as though bound to the soil yet still restless. Lantern light revealed nothing but her. Yet, more than one witness swore they saw 7 shapes when lightning split the sky. It was in this period that the legend hardened into certainty. The orchard was no longer just a place of whispers, it was a place of revelation. The earth had shown its truth, and the villagers could no longer pretend ignorance. Bones had surfaced, graves had shifted, and the widow remained unbroken, untouchable, as though protected by the very soil itself. The magistrate never returned. No inquiry was made. And so the story settled again, heavier than before, weighted by the knowledge that the orchard had revealed itself and still nothing had been done. The villagers lived with it, because what else could they do? Fear chained them, and superstition sealed the lock. And the widow kept walking, lantern swaying, her lips whispering to the orchard that had become both her legacy and her curse. The 7th grave had not been the last, but it was the floods that ensured her story would never wash away. For once, the earth has spoken. No silence can erase it. By the time the rains had ceased and the earth hardened once more, the widow herself seemed to vanish into something larger than life. She was no longer spoken of as merely a woman, but as a shadow, an omen that haunted the valley. The orchard, heavy with graves and rumor, stood like a monument to secrets no one dared disturb. And then, quite suddenly, she was gone. Accounts differ. Some say she fled in the night, slipping away with nothing but her lantern. Others insist she was seen walking into the orchard one evening and never walking back out. A few whispered that she was taken, not by man or law, but by the very soil she had fed. swallowed whole as repayment for her bargains. Whatever the truth, the fact remained her house was found empty, her bed cold, her hearth ashen. The orchard, however, remained exactly as it had been, rows of trees heavy with fruit, shadows long and watchful, and the mounds of earth resting quietly beneath. Her disappearance sparked a frenzy of speculation. Some villagers claimed she had traveled west, reinventing herself in a new town, ready to ensnare another string of husbands. Others believed she had been dragged to hell, her body claimed by the devil she had served. Still others argued she had been nothing more than a woman cursed by fate, swallowed at last by the pattern she could never escape. Yet none dared to search her orchard for proof. Even in her absence, fear clung too tightly. Years passed. The house decayed, its roof collapsing, its timbers splitting beneath rain and sun. But the orchard endured. Travelers passing by spoke of its eerie abundance. Apples growing fat on branches even when surrounding farms withered in drought. Some dared to taste them and swore they were unlike any fruit known sweet yet bitter, carrying a weight that lingered on the tongue like grief. Others refused to touch them at all, crossing themselves as they hurried past. Local children spun tales to frighten each other that if you entered the orchard at night, you would see 7 shadows standing among the trees, waiting, that the widow herself still wandered there, lantern glowing faintly in the dark, her whisper audible if you pressed your ear against the soil. One story told that if you plucked an apple and cut it open, you would find not seeds but bone splinters hidden inside. Parents dismissed these tales, yet they too avoided the orchard, steering clear as though the air itself carried contagion. Over time, the graves became part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the natural swell of earth. But memory persisted. Old men in taverns spoke of her with lowered voices, warning travelers not to linger. Women still used her as a cautionary tale, telling daughters what happens when one strays too far from God. And every so often, someone would claim they saw her figure tall, thin, lantern swaying moving between the rows, though the house lay long abandoned. What is most unsettling is that no one knows how many men truly lay beneath those trees. The stories fixate on 6, sometimes 7, but the number changes with each retelling. Some say more graves sank into the soil, unmarked, unseen. Others whisper that she buried not only husbands but lovers, strangers, perhaps even children. The truth remains hidden, sealed by earth too fearful to be disturbed. Even now, 2 centuries later, the tale lingers. The orchard is gone, cleared away for farmland or devoured by woods. Yet locals still point to the hills where it once stood. They speak of odd growth there, of trees that sprout quickly, their roots gnarled like skeletal fingers. At night, hunters claim they hear murmurs in the wind, voices low and insistent, like men calling from beneath the ground. Whether these are echoes of memory or something darker, no one knows. Her trial never came. No magistrate ever held her accountable. She vanished into legend, her story a knot of rumor, superstition, and dread. Perhaps she was a murderer who used poison to clear her path. Perhaps she was a witch who fed her orchard with blood. Or perhaps she was only a lonely woman, her husbands taken by cruel chance, her name blackened by fear. But the pattern in the soil cannot be ignored. The orchard grew too fat, the graves too many, the silence too heavy. Something happened in that place, something that history could not explain, and the earth could not hide. And so the widow's tale remains unfinished. She dissolved into the night, leaving behind only graves, shadows, and a question that gnaws like roots in the dark. How many secrets still lie buried beneath the orchards of Virginia, waiting for the rains to uncover them once more? The story of the widow of Virginia lingers because it was never resolved, No records bear her name with certainty. No trial fixed guilt upon her. No grave marks her own resting place. What remains are Whisper's 7 men, an orchard that bore fruit too heavy for its branches, and neighbors too afraid to disturb the soil. Even now, her legend clings to the land like fog. Farmers still speak of hills where the ground feels soft, as though something stirs beneath. Old families pass down the tale. Not as history, but as warning, beware the woman who buries her husbands where roots can drink. Whether she was murderer, witch, or simply victim of cruel fate, the orchard became her testament. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the silence. Law did nothing. Neighbors did nothing. Fear, as much as superstition, allowed her story to grow unchecked. And so she vanished, not punished, not proven guilty, but absorbed into the dark corners of memory. The silence is more haunting than any grave. What do you believe really happened in Virginia's orchard? Were the men poisoned? Were they claimed by something older than death? Or did fear itself shape the story, until the widow became a monster carved from rumor history tried to bury her? But legends never stay quiet for long. Subscribe for more stories History tried to erase, and continue watching this video here.